I'll do it like this. Thank you very much, Nikita, also for the invitation to talk to you, although I had a big problem. After writing the abstract, I kind of was stuck with a puzzle I couldn't solve completely. So, in general, I would like you to ask you, when you see anything that keeps you wondering what the guy is talking about, please break in and ask me a question. What I started out with is slightly different than that Diana just talked to us about. I'm mostly interested in social networks, and the content and the meaning is a consequence in a way of emerging large data sets that we have in and outside organizations. I'm an organization scientist, and questions they raise about the connection between how people interact with each other and how meaning, language, I'm a bit sloppy in my language there or in my concepts, but meaning and language influence how people interact with each other. So what I did for this talk is try to... Nikita, can you help me to set it on slideshow? I'm not that good in Russian, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So where I start my puzzle with is a sort of three traditions. The social network analysis tradition has always been accused of being too technical. That's in part because of the type of authors that dominate the field, I think, more than that it is in principle technical. I will start with my first step there. Then there has been critique of the social network analysis approach in what we call relational sociology, where a few, or quite a few, Americans criticized social network analysis as being too technical. In relational sociology, there is more attention to content, but not yet towards semantic networks. And then semantic networks emerged from increased attention to content of what people were doing or are doing. What I will do in this presentation is go through like 3 steps, and I hope to keep them simple. I give not that many examples of my own work because it is quite boring organization stuff and technically not very advanced. So I give you some of the examples of what other people did as examples of what I intend to convey to you. And what I will try to convey to you, and I hope in the end to have succeeded, is that there is a need both to pay attention to the social network processes in the theoretical understanding of those processes, as well as meaning in order to connect the 2 areas of a network and co-network connections. So I will do that in 3 steps. First, I will try to establish some sort of linkage between social networks and meaning. And as a stepping stone, I use the recent categorization of social network studies by Borgatti, Brass, and others. Then I will go to socio-semantic networks, at least to the side that will connect it, and I hopefully will show some sort of connection between the theory and the methods employed that is convincing you. And lastly, I will give only a few kind of hints where I think it would take us, and they actually connect a little bit to the last discussion on Jana's presentation. Where are the boundaries of what we are looking at? So the first is a very simple or simplistic, but useful, at least in my view, useful way of distinguishing social network research if we go beyond purely social network methods. It is, I think, originated by many other people before Borgatti and others, but they summarized it into 4 categories of social networks we can recognize. The first, on the left-hand side, is 2 sets of state-related network connections. And state-related means that those connections are more or less pervasive. They are there anyway. They are maintained for a longer period of time. And they distinguish those in two different things. The left hand, and it has been mentioned yesterday already, is if you would look at the content, would be something like a similar cultural attitude as a basis of enduring relations, which is a little bit differently phrased than homophily. But it is basically homophily as a basis for social network relations. The second is all kinds of ways people have to position in relation to others. It might also hold for organizations, but let us focus on people. People with a certain role and a certain interaction necessary to accomplish things. People in a family relation cannot change those relations. Those relations are like a background. But they do not, both of them do not necessarily manifest themselves continuously in communication we observe. Because the communication we observe is not necessarily going about the deep similarities between people or talking about family constantly. So what we usually see on the right-hand side is events. We see things happen, and those are the things that we also see more on internet sites and knowledge community sites in companies. And there are two sort of different things. We can look at interactions, and we can look at the flow of information. What Borgatti and others say, and I'm not sure whether I agree with it, but I couldn't find a good example of it. The flow of information is very hard to measure. We usually only have the snapshots. Then I'll go to some examples within the social network tradition in which people, sometimes in a very abstract way, have looked at the manner in which meaning, language has an influence on the formation of relations. And this graph is from a study, a longitudinal study, which shows that meaning influences the formation of networks by Lizardo and Vesey and Lizardo, where they looked, I think, in the general survey of the US, they looked at whether people had what they call some kind of deep attitude, which is on the vertical axis, if it is readable, so they distinguish expressivist, utilitarian, community, and theatic or more religious feelings that people would have and would be consistently there. The question they ask is a social network related to this content at all? And what they show is that the content matters. They do it by a very complicated procedure, but they show that people tend to drop ties with people that don't have the same ideas. So in the long run, the networks become more homogeneous, and where they show that is in relation to 3 networks measured in this survey: using of drugs, being in trouble for youth, and being a volunteer. And you see that these cultural attitudes matter for the formation of the strong ties. So in that sense, a sort of structural relation between meaning and social network choices exists, so social network choices exhibit meaning. The second one might be more familiar or not to you, but the second one is also more based on text extraction. But in this case, you do a very formal text extraction of actors, subjects, and the objects of the relation, which means that you use text in a very, and it is not automated, only to some extent. And this is partly work, there's work done by more people, but it is like Jan Kleiné and Huis uit de Vu and others, it is a very abstract way of looking at networks. In this case, Franzosi and others have looked at newspapers from the 19th century, where they looked at lynchings of black people, and they looked at these lynchings in relation to the flow of events outside, and they tried to figure out what actually happened with regard to the various parties potentially involved. In this case, the meaning is embedded in the texts we have, and it looks a little bit similar to the things Jana Diesner just talked about before, but it is much more driven by theories about how influence between various groups occurs under certain conditions. So you can get social networks out of text is basically the message. Then the third I wanted to mention is a study by Gibson, a series of studies by Gibson on conversation and interaction. In these studies, he tries to figure out whether the sort of things we see in, for instance, email exchanges or other exchanges exhibit an underlying pattern. So you don't yet look in any of these studies to the very detailed content that we have in text these days. So that is a third way in which social relations and communication and meaning of communication might be interrelated. In the picture, he shows the interaction between X and A, and then he argues that if you look at very long measurements of conversations, you can see that the way after addressing the other party, the moving of the conversation indicates an underlying permanent social relation. One of the things that is also very difficult if we looked at the last presentation. So what I think that there is in social networks, more than the eye sees normally when you look at the literature, on the relation between various approaches of networks and the way we can handle the content or the meaning of what happens in these same networks. So the second step is a sort of attempt by reading through the literature and how can we systemize the methodological choices that can be related to content measurement. And I think there are like a zillion more various specific methods, but not very well grouped. I've looked for it. I can't find very good and well-defined descriptions of what semantic or meaning analysis of structure actually means. So I kind of made it up myself on the basis of what I saw, and I think that one of the things is called thematic analysis, what Franzosi calls narrative quantitative analysis. The other one might be some sort of analysis of what actually is attached to people, and I go back a little bit, I show an example in a minute. Then I supervised some work by Peter Mika, who is a computer scientist, but he used a combination of social network insights, so the references people make to each other on websites and the content networks. And the last one, which I kind of think is a logical way of connecting meaning and social networks, is two-mode network analysis. To quickly go through this and show a little bit the sort of things that were discussed in the previous lecture. This is from Kaufer and Carley, and they argue on the basis of this picture that if we look back to what I introduced just before, the homophily type of things actually do not really address the choices people make in connecting to each other. So if you would use the ideas people have, like Lizardo did, then you cannot actually match it as easily as you think. If you look at this picture, the question might be how people, if you have a knowledge representation or a word communicative representation, how people like A would choose their counterpart. It is not as logical as you would think, because there are many ways in which they are, this person A is similar to any of the others. It is not necessarily determinative. So if you're going to reconstruct what people would present as their views and use that as a way to reconstruct a social network, that would not be a very appropriate way to find the right social connections. The second example I wanted to show is the other way around. So this is a representation of Web 2.0 already a long time ago. Peter Mika did a study for his dissertation, which I partly supervised together with others, on how you can reconstruct what actually in this sea of information in the internet is what is really meaningful. And the technique he employed was looking for both elements at the same time. So this picture is a it looks like a co-word picture, and it is, but it is based on selecting of the words used by people that are already connected to each other. So he didn't take the whole element of everybody writing or discussing Web 2.0, but only those scientists and researchers that actually worked in the field and communicated with each other in order to reconstruct this, in his view, meaningful picture. And he has a very nice set of publications on the internet, including his book that shows how to work through these combinations of social networks and meaning. Then the last one, this is work by Quantet and Rowe, or the picture is from them, is you can, of course, if you go to the right-hand side of the previous Borgatti and Brass picture, when you go to conversation, you actually can see what people say in various fragments of what they argue or what they write about in mail, and you can try to connect that in a two-mode network analysis, by which you connect the two sides. And especially recent work by Lomi shows some interesting ideas about whether actually the people move the words or whether the meaning of various terms is very important for certain conversations. So there is a kind of dual causality. I hope the arrows are visible, but I think that if we map these last three examples I gave of more precise methods that start out from some sort of co-word analysis or meaning analysis on the type of ties where we have theories about that, actually we could try to sort out the methodologies a bit better in relation to what type of network we want to say something about. And I think that it is very useful to restrict most of the social network theories to the type of network we are talking about. That is basically the message that Borgatti and others gave. I think that, for instance, one of the areas that is lacking is that on the left-hand side, the sort of thematic attribution, what social actors actually intend to do, or what type of meaning they want to convey to others. It is very hard to get it out of the data, while it's clearly very significant for social network theories and social network reasoning. The second is the thematic content analysis has more of a empirical problem that has been exposed by many people that look at newspapers like Jan Klein-Nijenhuis or Franzosi on historical sources, that many of those sources are quite incomplete. If you would look at pure semantic analysis, it could be useful, but enters into the boundary problems that have been mentioned before. You do not know in what context always. There is a conversation by what type of people, and it is really necessary to understand that, to understand at least the relation to social network process formation and social network functioning. And I think that word actor, two-mode networks, but there will also be a three-mode network talk tomorrow by someone else. But I think that two-mode has been undervalued a little bit in both areas, in both the social network area and in the area of co-words. So that's like the second step. I think we can sort out things. I'm glad Nikita invited me to think about sorting it out, so I have some idea where to look for, but I still miss a few things. And I didn't mention my colleague where I have these discussions with. I'm more a social network person. My colleague is Ina Helstein. She's more a word and communication person. So I end with a few slides on strategies to try to sort out how to make boundaries when you have to do with both communication and results of communication as well as social networks. And partly that has to do with being much more precise about whether the producers and publics of communication, of language in certain situations actually are overlapping or not. So most people assume when they do these studies that the producers of the language that they analyze are the same as the users, which is not the case. It raises a big problem, I think, for social in interpreting the social network side. So one is this shift, and the other one, which is basically something that really arises from the work by Ina Helstein, and she was a postdoc with Lud. So there are certain connections with Lud Leidersdorf as well, is that she suggests that in order on the other side, so first one is the boundary of the social networks as something to take into account for methodological choices. The other one is to be much more careful about the way meaning and text influence the development of social networks. And a few of the suggestions that she and I developed in a paper that was rejected because it was not theoretical enough, is that, for instance, certain communication elements like shared stories or jokes might be elements that connect groups together, that start to help to integrate the social interaction. And vice versa, the use of language that can help to create your own boundaries and maintain them, like jargon, should be in a way extracted from the text you are looking at, and that's a much more complicated process than just semantic processing in order to distinguish what two groups actually share or do not share, and whether they actually develop jargon in order to separate themselves from others. So then you have at least some ideas about the mechanisms that might connect from the other side of the content, the meaning of what we do, to the development and evolution of networks. So to finalize, I hope I have shown where my puzzles are in the relation between social networks and meaning structures from both sides, some sorting of methodological assumptions related to at least a more consistent way of looking at social network theories. And lastly, first sort of steps to try to develop integrated ways of looking at the very challenging area or theories we need to connect meaning and networks. I think there might be questions.
One, two. Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Peter, for this overview. I think pretty much more on the perspectives of the socio-semantic networks analysis rather than what has already been done. Because there is still a lot we could work on. Actually, we're basically working on what you have shown on the previous slide with Wouter, and our presentation will be about it, to what extent semantic networks intersect and differ within collectives and groups. And so I would like to invite questions for Peter.
Peter, thank you very much for your presentation, and I just can't resist. You seem to see social network as a theory, and I just don't see that. So could you give some ideas about what is theoretical in social networks or social network analysis?
Well, I would say that, in a way that is directly the confusion, because if you limit it to social network analysis and do not look at the social processes that produce these structures, then you probably end up with asking this question. But I think that if you would look at, let's say, early ethnographic studies where people looked at structures of villages, and they had some ideas about kinship and developed those in theories about kinship, then the structure should, in a way, only in an analytical sense, be an element in which you prove certain dynamics and changes or relations between villages in a kinship structure. Similarly, if you look at the way Borgatti and Brass were forced in a way to develop all kinds of mid-range theories. So I'm not thinking about the large theories, but the mid-range theories about knowledge exchange. Suppose certain elements of shared interest or knowledge between people in an organization. So you need to have some sort of theory predicting that people that lack information are going to search for it with others. And within that there is sort of mid-level theory that explains, at least in terms of organization theory, how people would go about that. A little bit like the Carly and Kaufer thing. And there are 2 or 3 theories that explain why people will either search for knowledge or not search for knowledge that they miss. And a social network is then an expression of whether they follow one strategy or another. So I see it more as an analytical testing tool, the social network analysis, than probably you do. And I probably have other types of theories in mind than you have.
Do I understand correctly? So the theories are just anthropological, organizational theories, which
in main lines,
address also relations between people or relations between people and objects.
Yeah.
And we completely agree.
Okay.
Well, yeah, probably the rules which are implied by those theories would be the theoretical assumptions of network research, I guess. And used in network analysis as a methodological tool.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Yeah, at the risk of too much in-crowd talk, let me just try. So the structural background variables which you give, like family structures which are not instantiated at each in the social network necessarily, I would call systems of reference in my type of lingo, and they would act as constraints or feedback mechanisms on what is possible action by the people involved. And then you could also perhaps say something about, so there's a conditional probability distribution, if you say it's very abstract. And then you could probably say something about what is unexpected or what is expected, so that it is deviant from what the conditional probability distribution would predict. Would that be a way forward?
Yeah, it might apply, but it maps quite nicely on the background papers that Freeman and Borgatti use are related to the same sort of thing. So the left-hand side of the matrix was the state. So that what you argue is basically that the state is not being represented in the network, but makes possible or more logical certain network connections than others. At least part of the state. What is Borgatti's in another volume, he calls it the backcloth, and that is very much the same as what you mentioned just now as a kind of system background variable or a system organizational structure. And the other is the flow and the events are the visible manifestations. Only you can ask people, of course, whether there is a potential for exchange. So there is a kind of intermediate layer of empirical studies where you, I think, can see which part of the what you call system elements actually work on real people.
So the potential in my, to pursue it one round further, the potential in my type of lingo would be the latent variables.
It might be, yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for your presentation. I have a question about the maybe third layer on the like social network, semantics network, and the maybe emotional networks, because what we talk about with people, it's not mostly about meaning. There are a lot of like cheap talk, but it's very needed for our relationships. And maybe you know about these studies, or is there something that study like meaningless conversations or words or something like this?
You mean that if you would, I mean, one of the distinctions I tried to make was that a little bit like the question in the previous session, that you need to know the context in order to really make an interpretation of the structural language component, if what you would see in semantic webs. And basically what you ask, as far as I understand, is are there words that have a higher emotional value to people that therefore would drive certain elements?
They don't have meaning at all, but they need it for us to communicate. Like, I don't know, the weather is good or something like this.
Yeah, I'm a bit doubtful whether I can really answer that question, I must say. I know that in a number of areas right now there is increasing attention to emotion, but how, and I have a few students that show, for instance, it's not a network study, but an interaction in a bank in the Netherlands, just around the corner of my university. There is a discussion on CSR internal, and people really shout at each other and become very angry with certain words. So I agree that there is an additional layer, but it's very hard to reconstruct in non-real life situations where you can see what the interactions are, what the emotions are, because the emotions are not, well, one of the things he finds is that the emotions are different for the different identities involved. So the professional corporate social responsibility people become very angry at some words, and the other side becomes very angry, not so much at the fuzziness of sustainability, but about how to measure it. So the two sides are becoming angry in meetings, but part of that is also overlaid by interpersonal feuds, or what you call them. So people that become angry at their boss every time they see him. So it is very difficult and rather, at least in my feeling, rather difficult to disentangle those elements.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can consider, I guess, well, it's interesting. We can consider emotion as a context, but we can also try to, approach them with network analysis. But here we have the problem of capturing the nodes and the relations and measuring it somehow, I don't know, as another network. We have social network, semantic network, and maybe emotional network.
Well, there's one thing you might look at, that is there is a paper or a few papers by Wayne Baker where he looks at energy, which is close in the way he operationalizes it to emotions, and then you can ask people whether they gain energy when they meet someone in a meeting or whether they lose energy. And not very, the outcomes are not very exciting because bosses mostly are energy dumps. People lose energy when they meet their boss, and they win energy only by certain other people. But it's a different network than the communication
basically
network.
In resonance what Randall Collins writes about emotional energy and when it decreases or increases in the interaction rituals. And he also, well, he theorizes that through network perspective, but again, doesn't operationalize it. Yeah. Any other questions, comments, I think? Okay, thank you, Peter. Very interesting.